Hello, School Garden Mentorship community. Welcome to the fourth School Garden Mentorship Program workshop of the year. We are recording the day after we had our workshop yesterday afternoon, and now it's the next morning because unfortunately I forgot to hit the record button. So here we are running through the presentation to give you an overview of the workshop from yesterday. Before we start our workshop today, I would like to acknowledge that I am calling in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Cowichan Nation, who have lived here since time immemorial. I'm a second-generation settler on this land, and I'm living on land that I recognize to be the lifeline of the Cowichan Nation in the past and for future generations as well. And it is my commitment to be part of reconciliation in this community. During our workshop, we had folks share and chat the different communities they're calling in from and recognizing their territories. For those of you that are new to the School Garden Mentorship Program, my name is Tessa, and I am the Central Island Community Animator with Farm to School BC. I'm also a teacher and a farmer, and I love my work as a community animator because I get to combine my passions of growing food, connecting community, and working with students in classrooms. As we mentioned in last month's workshop, Addie has moved on from her position as Food Literacy Advisor with Farm to School BC to focus more on her teaching, and we are grateful to have Kaylin step into the role. Kaylin has a rich background in education as well as farming, and I'll pass it over to her to share a little bit more about herself.
Thanks, Tessa. I'm so excited to be joining you today and going forward as the Food Literacy Advisor with Farm to School BC. Yeah, just excited to get to know people and to get to be a part of this program. And I'm joining you here today from the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And today, I'm just going to give you a brief overview before we start about Farm to School BC. Farm to School BC is a program that brings healthy, local, and sustainable food into schools across British Columbia. We provide students with hands-on learning opportunities that develop food literacy. Farm to School BC is a program of the Public Health Association of BC and is supported by the province of British Columbia and the Provincial Health Services Authority. This is a map of our hubs, where we have folks, all of the animators kind of work within these communities. And here's, I think the next slide is a picture of all those lovely people. And I know that they are always excited to hear from folks in their regions. So if you want to get in touch with them, you can find their contact on the website. And I think
we're ready to go.
Yeah, we're ready to go.
Awesome. Thanks for the background, Kaylin. So welcome to our fourth School Garden Mentorship Workshop. As always, there's so much we're excited to share with you, and we're going to focus on 4 different topics today. So we'll start by talking about how to plant your crops and how to plan for that with Farm to School BC crop planning resources, both our crop cards and our crop planning charts. After that, we'll talk about routines and activities that can support outdoor learning and garden learning. After that, we'll talk about how you can build relationships with your community, and especially the role of signage in building relationships. And we'll end our conversation today looking at season extension. And for those of you that are eager to get out there and plant in the early April cold weather, we'll chat about how that can be more successful. So I'll pass it back to Kaylin to get us started.
Thanks, Tessa. So planting with your class is really, this section is thinking about planning and what are some of the questions you might be asking yourself, and then also thinking about like what are some of the tools that might help you make some decisions about what it is that you are going to be planting this year. This is something that you really want to think about with your garden community, with your team, with all the folks that you're going to be working with this year. Thinking about, these are some of the really important questions that I think can help you make a decision. I know when I get to the seed store, I'm like, or I get a seed catalog, I just like get so excited and I want like one of everything. And that can be really fun as well. And I try to make space in my garden every year to sort of have like experiment space where I have some of those things that I'm like, I'm just dying to know what's going to happen here. But also it's really great to plan. And as teachers, you guys will know that as well. So thinking about what your budget is for the plants and seeds that you're going to grow. If you're dividing things up amongst your classes in the garden, who's going to plant what? Thinking about your capacity for care and maintenance. So who will be taking care of these things during the school year? And also if you're carrying things over into the summer months. And then also thinking about sort of with the end in mind about the food that will come out at the end. How are you going to be harvesting it? And how are you planning to share it with your community? Thinking about timelines and calendars is like a big part of planning and a part of growing. And I think that this is sort of like some of that math component and really thinking about, hey, this is like how long it's going to take this seed or seedling to get from this stage to this stage. And so on our website, we have these crop planning charts that are things that you would find also in like a seed catalog, in the West Coast seed catalog. They have these as well. But we've sort of pulled out some of these crops that are really great to think about if you're trying to plant something now or in the next little bit that you'll be able to harvest before the end of the school year. And so we have these broken down for like coastal crops in the interior region and also in the north. And these are crops that are generally ones that like cool weather, like cooler soil. So they're ones that might be harder if you were trying to grow in the summer months. But some of the ideas like that are always really good. I remember one year with my class, we only grew radishes and it was great. It was so I feel like too, it's nice to know like you can just plant one thing. I don't think it has to, you can keep it simple. And but these are really great ones: kale, bok choy, peas, radishes, lettuce, spinach. These are ones that you're definitely going to be able to see something come up depending on the season and the temperatures that you're kind of getting this time of year. So I think with the next seed, this is, or sorry, next slide, not seed. This is a sample of the crop cards that we have on our website, and we have a set both for spring and for fall. These are a really great resource to use with your class. And it's like a ready to go kind of worksheet that you could use with them, and really taking some of that information from the seed packets and expanding it out a little bit bigger. So this is something that you could use to really bring your students into that planning process and to get them sort of thinking about like, what is it that we're going to need to do to take care of this seed that's going to grow into a plant? How long is it going to take to grow? How deep or how far apart are we going to need to do this? And it's a really great resource. So I think I would encourage people to go take a look at them on the website. They're really great. Spring perennials are also another great thing. And I think they're really good for long-term planning with your garden committee and team. And I think a nice thing to think about, especially when you're starting, is like, oh, maybe we could add one perennial to our garden every year, or that kind of thing. And you sort of start building up that structure a bit in a garden space. So it doesn't feel like you have to have everything all in one year. Strawberries and rhubarb are like my favorite combo. I love those guys together. Strawberry rhubarb pie is one of my favorite treats, but things like chives and mint are really great to come back again. I'm always surprised every spring after the winter, those things they just keep going and they're really happy. But woody herbs are a nice thing to have in the garden as well. And sorrel is a great spring one as well. It'll come back and it's a nice one to get to taste right away early in the year. There's a really nice lemony flavor that comes along with it. We've put this here, and it's watering and thinking about maintenance and care. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our next workshop in May, but it is something that I think it's just part of the thought process and part of the planning all along is who's going to be caring for this? And when you're making decisions about what you're going to be planting, it can help make some of those decisions. Do you have capacity, or are people going to be available to be watering during July and August when school's not in session? That's one of the things I think, like, I know our school garden committee has struggled with the most, is just really thinking about, like, how are we making choices so that we know within our school, we don't have a lot of capacity in July and August. So we just know that our planning is set for those months sort of before school ends in June. So this is the same thing that we showed you earlier, but it's looking at sort of those timelines. But if you're thinking about, if you were planning, if you do have capacity in your school, or you're wanting to try that, how you are planning for fall crops and things that you could put into the ground now or a little bit later in the spring that will come to maturity when you come back in September and October, which, like, if you do have capacity, can be a really great way to start the school year, is just having that kind of set. And it's, especially if you're building that up in your school culture, it's something to look forward to when you're returning back to school in September. So tomatoes and peppers are like a big fan favorite. And I think these are ones that have a little bit more high maintenance, and folks who do these, like, know sort of what comes around tomato and pepper growing. Those are things that you could plan to plant in late May, and definitely you would need folks to be in the garden or to be watching out for those ones over the summer months. Fall harvest crops that you can plant in June that are a little bit lower maintenance maybe, but and just different kind of timelines. Thinking about squash, winter squash is one of my favorites. Thinking about potatoes, carrots, and beans. My class this year, they're working on potatoes, and it was really great getting them set up with that. I find that, like, there's something very strange and mysterious about potatoes and the way that they kind of grow and multiply and come up and out of the ground. And every year when I've grown them, when I get into the ground and you, like, pull them back out, it's just like, it's shocking to me every single year. And so some of those can be like a fun thing to have a surprise with in the fall. And with our school, we have we share the potatoes together. We kind of have like a potato party once they're all ready to go. So that's like a really nice community building thing as well. Again, these are the fall crops. So there's, like I said, a set of spring and fall crop cards. So same kind of idea. It gives you a sense of that. And I like that picture, shows like that mysterious little, like, potato multiplication. Great. So I'm going to pass it over to Tessa now to talk about garden routines and activities.
Thanks, Kaylin. I still get excited about digging up potatoes every year too. So yeah, anything that grows in the ground, pulling up carrots, the mystery is real. That's exciting. So now that we've talked about what you want to grow and how you're going to plan for that, when you're going to plant those things, it's time to think more about how are you going to do that with 25 kids, little helpers in the garden at the same time. It can feel pretty chaotic. So I'm here to chat about some routines and some activities that you can do to help engage students in that outdoor learning environment in the garden. Before I talk specifically about garden activities, let's step back and look at outdoor classroom routines in general. Before I was a classroom teacher, I was an outdoor educator for a decade, and I naively moved into classroom teaching thinking, great, I'll just take my 25 kids outside and I'll see that wonder, that magic that I witnessed as an outdoor educator. But quickly learned that when you're a classroom teacher and kids are used to the boundaries and expectations within a classroom, it can be hard for them to transition into an outdoor learning environment. So there are some routines that I developed with my class to really support them learning outside. So a few of these routines that I'll share today is, one, a reminder to use that inside space to talk about the activity ahead of time. We say, tell inside, do outside. By the time you get outside, those kids are eager and ready to jump into the activity. So prime them first in your indoor environment. While you're talking inside about the activity, it's also a great chance to review the expected behaviors. When the classroom walls are down, kids can forget some of those expected behaviors that they have in the classroom, but they can still apply in these outdoor learning environments. And in that is a reminder that the garden is an outdoor classroom and not just an outdoor recess space. So often gardens are part of our recess routines, which is wonderful, but when you're in there as a class, there can be different expectations when it is an outdoor classroom space. One of the routines that I love most about teaching inside is I get to step back from my role as a teacher at the front of the class and learn alongside students and make space for nature to be the teacher. If I can be inquisitive, curious, mentoring with students along by asking questions and prompting wonder, then I can learn alongside them and let nature teach us all the amazing things that there are to learn in a garden. One thing that I really find helps set myself up for some hands-on learning opportunities with students in an outdoor situation is having station learning. So once I develop core routines, there can be more opportunities for independent learning in small stations, and then I can work with a small group of kids doing hands-on learning with them. So I recommend setting up a kind of station routine with your students. Part of that station routine and part of just easing your workload as a teacher outside is having roles for your students. As you know, kids love jobs. Especially younger ones. And if you can set up things like there's always someone that carries the tools or someone that does the sweep at the end to make sure you're not leaving anything behind, having those jobs can make your life easier and also just engage students in the process. And lastly, just a reminder to bring the outside back in. I feel like it's great to observe things in their place outside, and then it's also a great opportunity to have more close observation in the classroom. I enjoyed in my classroom, I often have a terrarium set up and kind of a science station, and that would be an opportunity for students to bring plants or insects from outside, give them a safe home inside the classroom, or we can look at them under a microscope or observe them throughout the day, see what they're eating, talk about what sort of habitat we might need for those insects. So a great opportunity, even if it's not a terrarium, just bring samples back into the classroom and take a closer observation with them in the classroom. So those are very few routines I think can be applied to all outdoor classroom, outdoor learning environments. But let's now look more specifically at the garden. There are certain routines that I like to set up in the garden, in part because it lessens the workload as a teacher. You don't need to always be thinking about a new activity or gathering new supplies or new lessons. If I have certain routines that I do every time in the classroom, it takes that burden off me. And I do find sometimes I go out in the garden and just do these core routines. I don't bring a new lesson or a new idea. I find it also deepens the learning for the students, especially because nature is so dynamic and changing throughout the season. If they're practicing some of the same core routines week after week, they're tuning in on a deeper level and really noticing the changes week to week in the garden. So a few of the routines that I think of with my students in the garden environment is I'm mindful of my entry and exit routines. Not unlike going in and out of the gym, any other learning environment, think about how you want students entering that space. Maybe it's a spot they always know and go sit down, and another place where they always put their supplies, but just having a way that they're mindfully entering the garden. Along with enter and exit routines are also opening and closing circles. They can be a great way of inviting or inspiring learning and reflecting on learning at the end of the day. An opening circle can be as simple as me sharing a 2-minute story about something I observed in the garden earlier in that day. And a closing circle can be as simple as a couple students sharing a few things that they experienced from the garden. Or it can be more of a larger collective sharing space. But that can be a nice way to frame your learning in the garden. Another routine I enjoy is a garden tour, just noticing what things are different week to week in the garden. That can be a teacher-led activity, or it can be more of an independent activity for students in the garden too. One of my favorite routines, and this is a really common routine in outdoor education, is a sit spot. It's a quiet solo place that students find and they tune into their senses. So students would find a quiet spot in the garden and think about, what am I listening to? What am I hearing? What am I smelling? What am I feeling in the air around me? It can be short, it can be long, but I find once students develop the routine of a sit spot, it's something they often ask for. They really appreciate that quiet moment in the day to just be in the garden. Another activity that is great for especially developing independent learning is a journaling or observation activity, and I'll get more into detail on that later. Scavenger hunts can be another great routine, and again, I'll detail that later. Read alouds, the garden can be a wonderful place to bring in your literacy, whether that be a teacher-led read aloud or silent reading or buddy reading. It can be a great place to bring some of your literacy into the garden and have some quiet time in the garden. Lastly, one routine I love, probably not a weekly routine because it can take a bit more work, but it's tea time in the garden. Sometimes there's not enough to harvest a whole meal out of a garden, but there's often enough to make tea with. So whether that's some herbs that you can put in hot water, some flower petals, bring out a thermos of hot water in the beginning of your time out there, add a few ingredients to it, and then you can enjoy tea time at the end of your time in the garden. So those are a few routines that can really support station learning. So once you develop these routines, it increases students' independence because they know the routines, they know the expectations, and those routines can be incorporated into your stations as you're having some more hands-on stations directly with the teacher. So we're gearing up this time of year, getting excited to plant, getting excited to get out there in the garden and do the seeding with students. But that actual moment where you're planting seeds can be really quick and chaotic. And I find it can be great to build more student investment, student buy-in, student connection in the weeks leading up to that. So there's some activities that I enjoy doing in my class before we actually get out there and plant our seeds. One of those activities is reviewing seed catalogs. West Coast Seeds puts out a great growing guide every year, and it is like a glossy full color magazine of exciting vegetable varieties. Students love looking through, like, can they find the spiciest pepper or the most bizarre colored vegetable? And West Coast Seeds will give your class a whole class set of these. So bring the seed catalogs into your classroom and start getting excited about those wild varieties out there. It's great to also bring in seeds before you're actually planting the seeds. Have a seed exploration. Look at all the cool different sizes and shapes and textures that seeds come in. Think about, why is a seed shaped a certain way? Perhaps how is that seed dispersed? But get hands-on with the seeds. Another activity that I really enjoy doing is making garden signs. I encourage you, before you go out and plant with your students, that you have your labels ready. They can be simple labels or they can be more elaborate garden signs. I find garden signs a great opportunity to incorporate art and ADST into garden activities. And so students, as you see on the picture on the left, are painting their vegetables onto their signs, and they're building that sense of investment in their crop by putting that time into building signs. We just use regular acrylic paints on wood, but then we give it a coat with varnish to make it weatherproof once it goes outside. Another thing you can do is making a planting ruler, and that's the ruler you see at the bottom of the screen there, and that helps kids learn about spacing of different seeds. And yeah, you can use a regular classroom ruler too, but building the planting ruler ahead of time just builds in more connection. Another thing I suggest, if you have the opportunity, have some time to observe your seedlings inside. If you're planting seedlings in the garden, get them a day or two early and observe them in the classroom for a little bit more closer detail. Lastly, prepare the soil ahead of time. Before you're going to plant, get out in the garden, pull away the mulch, aerate the soil, pull out any weeds that you're wanting to remove. Give the kids a chance to really dig in the soil and experience all the life that's going on in the soil. And then when you're ready to go out and plant, you're ready to go, which is great. So you've done these pre-activities, you're gearing up. Now it's time to actually get out there and plant with your students. So again, we recommend a station-based approach so that you can have 4 or 5 students that you're supporting doing their planting while other students are doing other stations. These stations could be some of the core routines we talked about, like journaling or scavenger hunts, or they could be specific to planting day, like watering or doing some more weeding around the areas that you're planting. So here's a list of some of the stations that we recommend, and I'll go into a bit more detail about what those stations can look like. So at the planting station, this is a station likely you or an EA is supporting. We have a few tips to help set you up for success. First of all, like I mentioned earlier, have your labels ready. It's amazing how quickly after I plant and cover something with soil, I forget what I put in the ground. So I always try to put my label in before I even seed into the area. If you are wanting to grow in straight lines, set yourself up for success by either laying out string or some sort of meter stick on the ground, but thinking about how you're supporting students planting in a set area. Another thing that could be helpful is to remove the seeds from the seed envelopes. As soon as kids have wet, muddy hands and they're trying to reach into seed envelopes for seeds, you quickly have chaos. So I recommend pouring the seeds out into containers. Kids can observe them better. They can take smaller pinches of those seeds, and it keeps the rest of your seeds clean and ready for another planting day. You have options if you want to make holes for seeds. You can do that with fingers, with pencil erasers, with sticks, or some people prefer to plant in a trough, and you can just use a trowel to create a trough and then plant into the trough. Typically, when you're seeding a seed, you want it to be the depth of about 3 times the size of the seed. So bigger seeds, you're going to put more soil on top. Smaller seeds, you're going to put less soil on top. Some seeds are so tiny. Carrot seed is a really tiny seed that's a popular seed to grow in the garden. And one tip that I find useful for really tiny seeds is I actually first mix those seeds with peat moss or soil. So I get a bucket, put peat moss or soil in it, get the kids to dump in the seeds, and then we stir it. I usually use the analogy of cookies, chocolate chips and cookie dough, and you want to stir it so they're all evenly distributed. And then in that trough that I've made in my garden bed, students put the soil that they've just mixed the seed in that trough. It allows for a nice dispersal of the seed and a really great growing medium to keep those seeds moist while they're just still germinating. So that can be an option to do with the really tiny seeds. So those are just a few tips and tricks to help you plant seeds with students. The next station that you may have on planting day is a watering station. This is an opportunity for you to set your kids up for success. I find low flow watering works a lot better. Those little seeds just get blasted away if kids are using a high flow water system. So often I see the nozzle that's on the right-hand side of this slide used in gardens. And I don't know what it is, but kids always turn it to the jet setting and then blast the soil, and all the seeds you just planted are scattered everywhere. So I recommend some of the lower flow options. The picture just above that with the blue faucet, that's a watering wand. They're great because they just go on and off and have a really nice gentle kind of rain flow. Or you can use things like a watering can, or on the far left is a little like pressurized bottle that has a really nice mist option. So I encourage a lighter watering from students, but seeds do want to be deeply watered. So go back out there at the end of the day and make sure everything is well watered. Until those seeds develop good root structure, you will want to water them daily if the temperatures are warm. So something to remember in your daily routine. Perhaps you see a student that's really accomplished at the watering task, and it's great to be able to assign that to a student if they're ready for that. And do just think ahead around long weekends. Ideally, you're not planting on a Friday before a long weekend, because those seedlings do need that consistent watering in their first week before they're germinated. So in addition to seeding and watering, other stations that you might want to have on planting day could be a journaling or an observation station. This observation station could be very much scaffolded in a situation like I have shown on the screen, where there's a growth record, and every time they're going into the garden, they're looking at the same crops and filling out the same answers. It's a great opportunity to bring some science or math into your time in the garden. And I have posted an example of this growth record onto the Farm to School BC program library if you're interested to use it in your classroom. A journaling station could also be more freeform. This is an example of students doing scientific drawing in the garden. I find scientific drawing can be a great way to engage students in looking more closely, observing the details in a garden. A structure that I've used with my students to create an easy criteria for scientific drawing is the ABCDEs of scientific drawing. I find it's a criteria that's really easy for them to remember and encourages them to get into that next level of detail in their drawings. And again, on the program library, there's a slideshow you can share with your students to outline the ABCDEs of scientific drawing. Another great independent station can be a scavenger hunt. One way I like to scaffold this is by using egg cartons. And in that egg carton on the lid, as you can see in this picture, you can post pictures of what you're hoping the students will find. And the nice small egg carton containers is great for encouraging kids to pick small sample sizes of things. And again, you might want to talk about what is appropriate and how we harvest things for scavenger hunts in the garden. Lastly, a nice station can be a literacy station. Depending on your grade, this might be kind of a freeform story creation with loose parts and story stones, or as you get up in the grades, it might be more an opportunity for a journal entry, perhaps looking at telling a story from the perspective of an insect in that garden. The Diary of a Worm is a book that teachers often read to encourage that perspective taking. Like I said earlier too, it could just be a place for students to do silent reading or buddy reading, and can be a really nice quiet station to incorporate into your flow in the garden. So those are a few stations that you can use on planting day, or perhaps in the other springtime activities you're doing in the garden. When we had our workshop yesterday, we opened up the discussion to the chat and asked some of the teachers on the call, what is a core routine that you have in your class with the garden? And there were some great answers in our chat bar. So we just wanted to share a few of them with you today. One was, I spy of what is new, what has changed, and what stayed the same. The garden can change on a daily basis this time of year. So much is happening. So that's a great way to tune into those observations. Another person suggested a land acknowledgement. What a great idea, especially when you're actually outside connected to the land, to remember the history of the land and the people connected to that space. Another person suggested a same solitude spot every week to start, so they notice the changes over the season. I think that's great. We talked about the sit spot routine. But perhaps that sit spot, that actual place of the sit spot, stays the same week to week. So students are really noticing those changes by sitting in the same spot. Another activity was running through, I noticed, I wonder it reminds me of, as an observation and journal prompt. So yeah, there's so much you can do with journaling. Another suggestion that came up was weed of the week. We talked a lot about awesome edible weeds in the garden, but yeah, how can you find a different weed of the week? Perhaps it's a weed that you're excited to eat, or maybe it's a weed that's taking over your garden and you want to pull out. So looking at the weeds in the garden. One last one that someone shared was that they play a scavenger hunt game that asks students to find a color that matches what they're wearing, evidence of an animal, something that smells really good or bad. I love the suggestion that it doesn't always have to require a lot of pre-planning. Doing a scavenger hunt with an egg carton requires getting egg carts and printing out signs and all of that, but it can be as simple as, what are you wearing today? Can you find something in the garden? Go stand by something that matches the shirt you're wearing. So I like, that was a great suggestion as well. So much you can do in the garden, and I find one of the neat things about learning how to teach outside is not having to plan everything out and seeing what you're inspired by, see what the teachable moments are when you get into the garden. Maybe there's something you're noticing for the first time there, share your excitement, and trust that there's going to be so much going on that there'll be lots of conversations and learning to be had without having to pre-plan everything as well. So I will now pass it back to Kaylin to talk more about relationship building in the classroom, in the garden.
Thanks, Tessa. I really love like as a teacher, I know like the first times that I tried to go out into the garden with a class, they were like wild. And I think like those core routines and that idea of sort of like building those up is so helpful. And just like you would build those like routines in the classroom as well. But I think like it does take a little bit of time to shift that in kids thinking if they're not accustomed to that learning outside, and then also finding like ways to be grounded or contained in that space. So I really like them a lot. I'm going to talk now about signage and relationship building in the garden. And this is an extension kind of thinking about how you're building up your school culture, the garden culture at your school. And signage can be a really great way to do that. And thinking about why are we making signs? And Tessa made reference to like one of the really important pragmatic parts, which is like knowing what is planted where. So signs can be important for all kinds of communication, identifying plants. There are ways of sort of building a story around your garden or sharing with the broader community about what it is you're doing there. It can also help with the management and organization of the garden. So thinking about like how that communication is happening amongst colleagues, amongst people in the school community, but also folks who are maybe visiting the garden and learning what you're doing. And then also, again, it's just having that kind of visual where students are seeing themselves reflected in that space, either through art or design, things that you're using to sort of build up that structure in that space. And I think I find it really helpful to think about like that outdoor space, just not as completely different from inside the classroom. And lots of those things that you would use inside the classroom environment are really helpful, like thinking about visuals, thinking about how signs like really communicate a lot, and thinking about like the diversity of our learners and how those things can support them, both as like users and growers, but also as people who might be learning from that space. Rules and conduct in the garden are like, this is the hardest. I always have a hard part with rules as a teacher, but I think that like it's a really great, and it's really important, I think, just like in the classroom, is like being really explicit around the expectations in the space. I think knowing like this is a great opportunity to be able to co-create with your class or with the garden committee, thinking about like, what is it that we care about in this space, and how are we supporting the activity that's happening there? So, and also just kind of really delineating that it is a different space than maybe the playground or areas where students are like digging trenches or building things. It's like a different kind of space. And both those things can maybe happen there, but it's figuring out a way to communicate it really clearly, and having an understanding of that within your committee and within your community. Mapping is also like a different type of signage that can be really useful. It's a great sort of like extension activity with classes, just in terms of thinking about how things are spatially oriented. But it also is like a really great communicator, especially if you're having gardens that are maybe different themes or different purposes. In this map, they're talking about, they've got like a salad bar garden and a salsa garden, thinking about like different, it's sort of part of that storytelling, I think, and a map can really help like visually, physically orient you, but also like share a lot of information as well. So this one is sort of like an abstract idea in terms of having that map. I know with our school, our garden beds are sort of just divided by like each division who is participating. And so that map is just, it's mostly used within our garden committee and with folks who are new to the garden. And but it also just helps kind of create a bit of like I think with our class, that really helps ground them. So when they come in, they're like, oh, look, like Miss Toy's class is growing this, and like, look at how their garden bed's doing. And like, oh, our buddy class has been growing this. That's really exciting. And so there's like a bit of camaraderie that comes around being able to see that, even if we're not all sharing and like we're not all growing together the exact same things. I think there is still an excitement around knowing what is where. With this next one, these are just thinking about those zones. So maybe if you've got a map, like we were saying in the last one, where there are different types of gardens, and this one, it's thinking about like pollinator garden or a butterfly garden. Again, like thinking about how you're communicating with your community, both like the school community and extended. What are we doing here? And maybe even the pollinator garden, maybe that's like an initiating thing for us to talk about. Like maybe we don't know what pollinators are. Who are these pollinators and what are they doing in our garden? So a sign can be a really great prompt when you're using the garden as a learning space. And I think even like thinking about engaging older level classes and thinking about developing those signs to be able to share, like I think it could be a great buddy activity as well, to sort of like have those older grades sharing knowledge with younger grades. So yeah. And the next slide, again, thinking about garden bed signs, similar kind of thing about identifying different parts of the garden. Also like thinking about labeling crops creatively. That's like, again, thinking about literacy as well, where you're like, you can have images. Some of these crops you're going to be able to see above the ground. Some of them are going to be under the ground. So even having those visuals, I think sometimes if we have come up in gardening, we kind of take it for granted that we know what stuff looks like or even what they are. But I think it can be like I think it's important to not take it for granted that we all know what this vegetable looks like. And garden signs can be a really great way for students to be communicating what it is that they're putting in, and sort of to imagine like, oh, this is one of the activities I've done with my class, like as a activity, is thinking like imagining what the seed is going to look like at the end and before you even tell them what it is. And I think that like sparking your imagination, where it's like, oh, we just don't take it for granted that we know that this, like, you don't have to know before, like that's part of the fun, is like you're excited and there's mystery involved in it. So yeah, and I think the next slide is, yeah, again, thinking about information slides, thinking about how, again, you're communicating outward, but also like an opportunity for students to be doing some of those research projects and looking into like, sort of talking about what that plant is, maybe some of those plant uses, or thinking about the history of the plant. Like that's one of my favorite things, is just thinking about plant history. And so another great extension activity. I think signage is a really great way to pair like literacy activities, social studies, science, those kinds of things. The next sign, again, thinking about like how you're wanting to communicate in the garden space. And I think this one is a really interesting one, is because the activity is there on the sign itself. And I think it can welcome like students into that kind of independent work, and also thinking about ways of like kind of getting the students to think about, oh, like here's the math that exists in the garden. So this one's just a great measurement activity. So this is a lesson, a learning activity that is on our website, and that could help you kind of set up for some of that signage building. And like Tessa was saying, it's a really great thing like that you could be doing earlier in the season before planting, or sometimes like that winter is going to drag on a little bit more. And I think that building the signage is a great like early spring activity, kind of like she said, to get kind of that buy-in and kind of to build a bit of that excitement around it. So that is on our website. And thinking about your shed. So not every garden, I know at our school we don't have a shed, but and we keep most of our tools inside the school, but I think like a shed is a great surface for extending some of that storytelling, for student voice to be visible, but also like a way to be thinking about communicating to people that this space is like a part of a community and it's occupied by people. It can sometimes be a site of vandalism. I know in my community garden, it's definitely the #1 spot that gets vandalized. And it can be really frustrating, but I think it's just learning different ways of communicating with folks like, hey, people are here and working in this space, and it's important to people who are working in this community. And that sort of brings me to this part where we're thinking about building relationships. And I think signage is like a really great way to sort of initiate that, but it's also us thinking about like, hey, our garden exists in a context. It exists here in the school context, but it's also part of like the broader community. So our neighbors in the school, also like our non-human kind of neighbors who we're sharing space with. And I think having conversations in your garden committee where you're thinking about like, what is the context that your garden is existing in, and sort of planning for how you might be engaging with some of those things can be helpful, or just even having those on your radar. I know vandalism and theft can come up in some of that, sometimes in having a garden. And I think really having that conversation before you are experiencing it can be helpful, because it kind of helps you frame it in your mind about like, what is your capacity for that? How are you going to deal with it? And I think something that can be really helpful to think about it and is just trying to approach the garden with like with generosity, and with knowing that that loss might be a part of having a garden as well. I'm working on that. That's me sharing. I'm working on. But yeah, I think one of the main, like, maybe Tessa, can you go to the next slide for me? This is one example that I wanted to bring up. I think there's like other examples that can come up, but birds are like one of those beings that can also be involved in taking or interacting with your garden in different types of ways. That could be at like the seed stage when you've just put fresh little plants in or seeds in, and they're like snacking on those. I've had crows come in and like dig up my, like they're like, I can see them watching from like over in the corner. And I just know in my heart, I'm like, you're going to come down here right after I've left, and you're going to snack on that. And you see these little holes. So, and so there are lots of really great ways to sort of deter birds at specific times as well. I think netting is one way to sort of, just create a bit of a barrier between things. CDs are a really great way. They're like a reflective surface that can kind of deter. But I think it's also great to think about something like that as a learning opportunity for your students as well. So like for me, my experience of that is like, we didn't even notice all the bird activity in our community until we started experiencing that theft and that loss. And so it can be something that can highlight like, oh, wow, we share this space with all of these different bird species. So we've got a picture of a bird feeder here. That's like a way of sort of maybe trying to redirect some of that activity to another location without trying to eliminate it entirely. And I think really talking with your committee about those things is helpful too. Like, hey, all of this life is like a part of these processes. And I think like Tessa talked about that, I think earlier, just thinking about process and product and like what's included in both of those things. So thinking about how birds might be a part of the process in the garden. Yeah. And then the final thing that we have here is just like a reminder about different types of security things. So there's like some things that you can't control, and then there's some things that you can control. And I think like the example of like locking the shed, locking the gate is like an example of that. So having routines built up around those kinds of things, especially like in a garden shed where you've got like expensive tools that you've maybe accumulated over time. And then thinking about like what kinds of locks. So just one tip that I think is helpful is thinking about having a combo lock, which is much easier to deal with, especially when you're working in a group of many people versus keys that easily get lost and buried in dirt. So yeah, anyway, thanks. I'm going to throw it over to Tessa now, and she's going to talk about early seasonal planting.
Great, thanks, Kaylin. Yeah, it's such a balance, sharing our garden space with all the critters and people in our community, and also getting really excited about a crop you want to harvest and then seeing it disappear and dealing with that disappointment. There's a level of wanting students to feel a sense of success and actually get to harvest something that is in season, and a level of letting it go, and it's all part of the process.
Yeah, I think I told this story yesterday, but just that one where I remember like I was so excited about peas, and the peas had been growing and growing. And it's like, you know, you can see they're like really ready. And then the next day I had come in and someone had come in and cleared out the whole crop. And I was just like, it was so devastating. And so I had to really like talk myself down out of it, where it was like, okay, someone else took the peas. Like how can you think about it in different ways? I think sometimes that theft can also bring up like good conversations around like access and security and all of those things too. So it's just like you said, it's finding that balance between those two things. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that story, Kaylin. I'm sure others can relate to it as well. So now that we've talked a bit about how to plant, when to plant, where you're going to plant, how you're going to build relationships, some of you might be eager to get out there and start planting. And we're all coming in from different regions, but I know myself on Vancouver Island, early April, I do get that itchy feet of wanting to get out and get seeds in the ground even before the frost is done, because you can feel that spring is here. So today we just wanted to round out the workshop by sharing a few tips and tricks for early season planting. So if you are wanting to get out in the next couple of weeks, here's a few things that you might want to think about. First of all, think closely about what varieties you're going to plant. Different varieties are well adapted for this cooler spring weather. So for instance, if you're planting lettuce, take a close look at the seed packets and choose a lettuce variety that is particularly adapted for the cool season. That means that it's more cold hardy, but it often also has shorter days to maturity. So something like snow peas or snap peas that we're commonly growing in our spring garden, look for how many days that plant will take to mature, because they can really range from about 50 or 60 all the way up to more 70 or 80 days. And those day lengths can be really critical when you're working within the school season that ends by June. So something to think about that. A couple other varieties I love for early spring planting. Mustard greens are super hardy. They can deal well with the cold temperatures and still grow quickly. Often they're quite spicy for students. I have some students call them the wasabi plant because it does kind of have that impact on us. A really mild mustard that I love for school gardens is called Tokyo Bacana. And it's a really nice crunchy, almost tastes more like lettuce, but is hardy like a mustard green. Another variety that I just want to elevate is the Hakurai turnip, also known as the Tokyo salad turnip. Very unlike the stodgy turnip that you might think of in a stew in the fall. This is like a crisp, tender turnip. It grows in the same days to maturity as a radish, so it just takes just over a month to be ready to harvest. And it's crisp and crunchy and almost sweet like an apple, a cross between like an apple and a radish. But they are a favorite of kids. It's hard to keep them in the ground long enough to grow to a good size because kids love snacking on them. And they're not commonly grown in school gardens. So yeah, take a look for Hakurei turnips, or Tokyo salad turnips is another name. So just a few varieties you might want to think about. Other things you can do to help you plant in the early season is adding some frost protection. A really common tool that farmers use, and unfortunately it hasn't translated to backyard gardeners, but it really benefits your garden, is this idea of using something called rime, or floating row cover. It's a lightweight fabric that you put over your plants. It allows light to still come through, but it maintains the heat in the soil. Just by a few degrees difference, but that's all plants need in this early springtime to really bolster their growing. So I've used rime in different places on school gardens and in my own garden, and I noticed that plants under rime grow way quicker than plants not under rime. It improves that soil temperature, but it also does a few other things. That it helps protect those plants from insects when they're really small, and also from kids' feet or snacking in the garden. So it just gives your seedlings in these cold months that extra boost. You can find it at any nursery store, garden supply center, and it comes in a big roll, and you can just cut off the sections that you need for your garden. If you take good care of it, it can last easily for a decade. So this is perhaps an investment initially, but can last over the seasons. And all these things that you're using in the spring, you could also use again in the fall to extend your season in the fall. You can get fancy with rime and put it over hoops. This is really great for some of those more fragile, taller plants. Like we're seeing the picture of tomatoes, they're protected under rime. But if you're just wanting to protect little seedlings, you're gonna lay it right down on over top of those seedlings. Put rocks on the side, bricks on the side to help hold it down, but it can be a really low-tech solution for giving your seedlings a boost. There's a lot more I could talk about with rime. I often like bring it with me when I'm traveling to school gardens and give out sections of rime just because I feel like it's so useful. But we have included a video in the program library to give you more details on how that can be used in the school garden. If you want to take your season extension up a notch, you can also build a cold frame or a mini greenhouse. It can be a great ADST opportunity with your students. As you can see on the picture on the left, that's a group of students I worked with building the frame that you can see on the right. That season, I had a group of students that were really excited to grow peppers, and we wanted something to have a really nice hot environment for those peppers over the summer. But we built the cold frame earlier in the season and first used it for our early spring plantings. And then we moved our transplants in there to harden them off to get them ready for the cold temperatures before planting them in the garden. And then we used that cold frame again after the peppers were done in the fall to protect some of our fall greens. So if you do invest time into building something like a cold frame, know that it can support your garden throughout the season. This is a simple, just wood frame construction with plastic stretched over it and stapled on. It can also be a really low-tech solution, super lightweight. You can move it around the garden, and it also lasts for multiple years. So yeah, if you're excited for a bigger ADST project with students for your garden, I really recommend the cold frame. After that, in our workshop yesterday, we asked folks in the chat to share what is their favorite spring crop they're growing in the garden. And it was so nice to hear some advice and ideas from other people on the call. So we wanted to share some of those with you today. A few that came up, some were the perennials like rhubarb and sorrel, nettles, some of those hardy annuals like arugula, snap peas, snow peas, lettuce, spinach. We got into great discussion about edible weeds that come up in the spring, like lamb's quarters, dandelions. I added sheep sorrel in there and purslane, but lots of great tasty weeds that come up in the spring too. Oh, and one other perennial I didn't mention, parsley. Well, I guess depending on your climate. On the coast, parsley grows year-round here, and it's a great spring perennial to have in your garden. Up north, I'm doubtful that it overwinters, but parsley can be another good springtime one. And then, of course, peas. I feel like peas are so great. You can plant them early in the season. Kids love snacking on the greens as well as the pea pods. And they're just, yeah, I feel like a school favorite. Easy to plant, nice big seeds, and typically quite hardy. Caitlin, is there any spring crop that you love to grow in the garden you'd like to share?
I think I think you and I were like connecting over our love of the Hakurei turnips. I really do think that it is one of my favorites. And then yesterday I thought it was great that you were telling people about the flowers on kale plants that have overwintered. And like when you've left your kale plants, at least on the coast, like over those winter months, that's a really nice like little treat. I love them. And then also like pollinators, bees love them. I think even the hummingbirds I've seen kind of like hopping around out there, especially early in the season when things aren't opening up yet. But yeah, these ones are great. I also love purslane. I was saying that to you. It was like a really exciting revelation when someone showed that one to me. So the weeds are always they're like a constant fascination. Yeah.
Totally. And weeds are such a nice crossover to learn a bit more about native plants in the garden too, and kind of bridge into those conversations as well.
Yeah.
And thanks for the reminder about kale. Yeah, it's neat. So many kids don't like broccoli, and yeah, they'll eat these kale flowers, which are essentially broccoli. But when they're sweet and ready out of the garden, it's so different. Any brassica, any cabbage, Brussels sprout, anything you've left over winter will send up a flower stalk this time of year. So leave those in your garden to enjoy. So that rounded out the content of our workshop, but we just want to share a few reminders before we close out for today. A reminder of our program library on the Farm to School BC website. So you'll see here's a snapshot of our website. If you go on the top tab to the School Garden Mentorship Program, the drop-down menu will highlight the program library. And that's where we're posting all the resources that we referred to in this workshop. It's also where we post our presentations as well as a video recording of our workshop. So check it out there. You'll see the resources from the previous workshops there as well. I also want to remind folks that we have our discussion groups follow the week after our workshops. The discussion groups are a great opportunity to dive deeper into the topics we have and be more a collaborative space to share ideas, problem solve together, share resources. We've been really lucky to have some very seasoned school gardeners join us in the discussion group, and I find I'm learning a wealth of information hearing some of their stories that they're bringing to the discussion group, focused still around the topics that we brought up in the workshop. And a reminder that you do not need to attend the workshop to come to the discussion group. They can be independent things. So please join us in the discussion group next Thursday, April 13th. Looking ahead to next month, we will have our next workshop on Tuesday, May 9th. And that workshop will focus on summer maintenance and volunteer management, a really important thing to be thinking of this time of year as you're thinking ahead to the summer season and how you're going to support your garden over the summer. There's also just great opportunities in summer management for building community and connections beyond the schoolyard. So a neat opportunity to look at some inspirational examples that schools have done around summer management. Lastly, I want to remind you of the Farm to School BC Provincial Conference that's coming up May 18th and 19th at UBC. It's an exciting opportunity to gather and share some inspiring examples from across the province. We have an amazing lineup of workshops, short talks, guest speakers, keynote speakers. I'm really looking forward to it. We do have our draft program released now on the website, so head on over to the website and take a look. We also have field trips on the day before, Wednesday, May 17th. So if you want to get hands-on and see some of the neat things that are going on in the Vancouver region related to food literacy, sign up for one of those workshops. Lastly, I want to remind you that Kayla and I are always here to reach out to in between workshops. We'd love to hear more about your school garden and what you got going on with your garden. So please reach out to us. Our emails are there, and send questions or comments our way. So thank you all for joining us for this 4th School Garden Mentorship Workshop. We look forward to seeing you next month in May when all your gardens will have grown so much more than they are right now. It's such a busy month in the garden between April and May, and such a satisfying month too to see so much change happen. So thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you.